Pleased to welcome you all to today's event, COVID-19, oil prices and prospects for Iran-GCC relations. The question before us this morning is the following. Is the double whammy of COVID-19 and oil price drop having any impact on ongoing foreign policy missions and financial military capabilities of various regional actors? The particular focus is on Iran and the GCC states. For this event, we are going to focus on them, but obviously if the conversation takes us in a slightly different direction, we're open to that, and I'm sure the panelists are open to that as well. Speaking of panelists, let me introduce them. It's an outstanding panel of experts with experience in tracking Iran, the GCC states, and the role of the GCC in the region. In the interest of time, I will introduce them very briefly, but you'll find their impressive bios on the MEI website. First, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Mohammed Baharoun, who is the Director General of Behuth, a leading think tank in Dubai. Mohammed will be providing us with GCC perspectives, I suspect with a particular focus on what the thinking is in the United Arab Emirates in terms of what COVID-19 means for the region, what the economic pressures are all going to amount to as far as foreign policy agenda of various countries are concerned. Next, we'll go to Dina Estandiari, who's a fellow at the Century Foundation here in Washington, D.C. Dina is a seasoned Iran watcher and Middle East expert, and she'll be sharing her insights with us in terms of Iranian calculations and perhaps a shift in Iranian thinking based on events unfolding in the region. And finally, I would like to welcome MEI's own Bilal Saab, Senior Fellow and Director of Defense and Security Program. Bilal will focus on impact of the crisis potentially on US policy in that part of the world. Let me also read this for you. This is part of my job this morning. Please do pay attention if you have a question in mind. Although this is a virtual meeting, I look forward to taking audience questions through Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can all see at the bottom of your screens. For those calling by phone or watching our panel on the live stream, you can ask a question on Twitter with hashtag MEI events or email events@mei.edu. If you have any technical issues, please use Zoom's chat function or email, again, events@mei.edu. Feel free to ask questions at any time throughout the panel. I'll be looking for all of your questions and we'll factor in as many as possible into the discussion. And with that said, we will begin. I'll turn to Dr. Baharoun to have him perhaps set the stage for this conversation this morning and ask him how it all looks like in the UAE, in Dubai, where he's sitting right now. Let me be not provocative, but let me ask you this, Mohammed. Is this a time of reckoning of sorts, or is this just another storm that will soon blow away and the region will carry on and business will be as usual? Floor is yours, Mohammed.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you particularly more than the invitation for the honorary PhD that you've just bestowed on me. I'm not a doctor, but I am since now. So thank you very much. The exam question is practically on whether the COVID-19 and the oil prices is going to change things, let's say drastically or not. My views is that yes, it will drive a little bit of rethinking about the situation, about priorities, but we might not see a 100-degree, shift from everything that we've used to be doing. So it's not a huge, drastic change. It is a storm, yes. Some people will weather it, but any storm would force us to rethink some of our giving. Now, are there any givens that we have right now that we think is going to change completely? In your question, you've asked about whether impact of oil prices, for instance, would impact things like spending on defense. I mean, only yesterday, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, during the celebration of the unification of the United Arab Emirates armed forces, said that the army or the armed forces will continue to be a cornerstone of our country. So I don't see any change from that. The change we've seen is that the different roles an army could play. So we've seen more contribution in post-conflict zones, the army playing roles in post-conflict zones. We've seen recently army lift for the aid being distributed to different countries. So these are new ways of looking at what can an army do in times of crisis like this. So the impact is not going to be only health. It's pretty much economic. It's also social. That means everything is going to be reconsidered. Now, at this point, with social distancing, we're experiencing life within 5 feet. So everything needs to be stretched from each other within 5 feet. Now, consider this in a submarine, consider this in an airplane, consider this in a bus. There's going to be a stretching of all capacities, stretching of our ability to move. That's an impact that will change a lot of things. Now, COVID-19 will also open up opportunities for others, and particularly in this situation, Iran. In my views, this is a wonderful opportunity for Iran to reinvent itself, to rebrand itself, the regime to start looking at creating partnerships with unlikely partners, cooperating on defending COVID-19, with not only the GCC, but also with the US. Why not? Exchange of expertise, exchange of medicine, supplies, exchange of, there's a lot that can be done on that level. But I think it will have to start from Tehran rather than start from outside.
Thank you, Mohammed. I'll ask Dina to answer that question in a minute about Iran and whether it's time or Iran's ability, willingness to reinvent itself. But let me follow up before I ask Dina that question. Mohammed, has this health crisis brought home the point of how the neighborhood really needs to start think more collectively? You and I have had this conversation before. It's not because of a lack of a will, but is this crisis making it just that much more urgent to actually sit down and talk? And I specifically want to ask you about on a bilateral basis. UAE has taken a number of steps in the course of the last year where you've reached out to the Iranians on your own without being prompted by anyone. Could you pursue that if there is any positive feedback coming back from the Iranian side? In other words, what I'm asking you is more collective spirit across the region, which would be an indication of maturity, if not independence, on the part of the region's states. Is that something you can see happen as a result of this crisis?
I think that already happened, Alex, and exactly as you pointed out, even before COVID-19, we've seen people trying to look at different things. We've seen that happening in Yemen, as you pointed out before. There's a new calculus in Yemen, and people who used to say that there's only a victory win don't say that as often as they used to. So there is a recalibration of all of that. But again, as you rightly pointed out, you extend the hand, you expect another hand to be extended. So I think until now, we still want to see if Iran is going to change things. And if you look at the very recent rhetoric, it's not changing much. I understand that sometimes rhetoric is a way of showing that there's something that is happening and there's a resistance to it, just like fever sometimes tells you that your body is resisting. But until now, at least to me, maybe Dina would know more about this, I don't see tangible evidence that Iran is actually using this time to change. But to answer your question, yes, there is a recalibration, there is a rethinking, and it started before COVID-19. There is an understanding for cooperation. It's not an understanding, I think it's a belief right now of cooperation. But I also would add that cooperation might not be only regional, because regional, the word regional is being used in Iran as some sort of euphemism to non-US. And I think that is a different way of looking at things. It's not only about a non-US type of, cooperation is going to be global, and US was involved in Iran even before the Islamic Republic. Just to say that the price of making up is taking the US out, I don't think that's a rational way of thinking.
Thank you, Mohammed. Actually, I want to come back to you later on in the next round and ask you specifically on that Iranian request that US basically packs up and leaves, and something I also like to ask Bilal about. But for now, let me turn to Dina. You and I spend all these hours every day following Iran, and there are all sorts of accounts these days. I mean, I was looking at the latest coming out of Israel, how Iran, by some Israeli accounts, is kind of rethinking its position in Syria. There's talk of Iran deciding that actually it's not worth the price, that they should sort of lower their presence. I frankly don't see any signs of that in Iran. I don't hear that as a part of the conversation. Maybe the Israelis have a different way of looking at it on the ground in Syria. But my point is this: have you seen anything that indicates that this crisis is a moment for Iran to sort of maybe look for that reset button? Because things are not looking good inside Iran. It's a very dangerous foreign policy agenda at times, the number of rivals Iran has picked up. So what is your take on that?
Thanks, Alex, and thanks very much to MEI for inviting me along for this. In answer to your question, sadly, I'm going to have to agree with you. I haven't seen any indication that Iran has any intention whatsoever of changing its current foreign policy. In fact, I've seen an entrenchment of Iran's desire to continue on its foreign policy in the region, if not from the perspective of people sitting outside Iran, a worsening of Iran's foreign policy in the region. And I think that's largely a result of the US's maximum pressure campaign on Iran, which has cornered Iran to the position where it's lashing out, which is why it's seen as being significantly more aggressive. Economic pressure isn't affecting its regional posture. And in fact, we saw the same thing in, I think it was 2010, 2011, during the previous rounds of sanctions on Iran that were pretty tough. Iran's regional posture didn't change really that much. And that's largely because money isn't really a driver of Iranian foreign policy. Defense, prestige, influence, security, ideology to a lesser extent, all of that, yes, but I definitely don't think money is. And the funding that it has to do what it does in the region doesn't necessarily come from the state budget, which is what is primarily affected by US sanctions. The money for Iran's foreign policy tends to come from murkier places, out of the reach of US sanctions, because it involves either, the supreme leader's private funding or, funding from black market trade that the IRGC runs. So I don't see Iran rethinking its regional posture, and I think that will be the case for as long as America's maximum pressure campaign stays on Iran. Now, admittedly, the COVID crisis has made things considerably worse inside Iran, but again, that might impact the way that they're running the country. I don't think it will impact the way that they're doing their foreign policy.
But Dina, do you see a danger in or underestimating the level of anger inside the Iranian society? In other words, and I don't want to bring up the Soviet Union as an example of being out there in the world but forgetting the home front, but we don't really know the impact of COVID-19 in Iran, and we probably won't know for months to come. It's not just limited to Iran, but my point is there is this building up anger. And I just wonder how much of that is part of the thinking, because if it's not part of the thinking, then you basically have a detached part of the Iranian system led by the Revolutionary Guards who are out there in the region doing what they want to do. And it might be too late by the time they realize actually they forgot to bring the people with them. And on the point of bringing the people with them, which is specifically my question to you is, well, how does Iran frame what it's doing in the Arab world? I mean, it's not a nationalist agenda. Most Iranians don't want to be in Syria. So how is this? If it's not a militant Islamist, ideologically driven agenda, how else can we explain it?
So I think actually the way to look at it is a little bit different, in the sense that I agree with you that there is mounting anger, but I would argue that mounting anger right now is focused on very specific aspects of the way that the government is dealing with the issues that it's dealing with. So I would argue that the majority of Iranian frustration is focused on the government for what it's done regarding the COVID-19 outbreak, for what it did when it shot down the Ukrainian plane, the way that it lied to the Iranian public, the way that it's running the economy. I think that that is really drawing the bulk of the anger and the frustration of the Iranian public. Now, if you had asked me this same question maybe a year ago, where none of these events had happened yet, and none of this frustration was so overt and so intense the way it is today, I would have said, yes, no, definitely, I do think that the Iranian public is watching what the Iranian government is doing in the region and doesn't really want to be in Syria, doesn't understand why in a tough economic situation it is involved in Syria. Now that ISIS is, or at that time, ISIS is more or less taken care of, then it also doesn't understand Iranian presence in Iraq. And then why are we in Lebanon? I mean, I do think that those questions were being asked, but I think today you have less of those questions being asked just because the focus is on other areas of gross incompetence that we've seen over the last little while. In terms of how it defends its regional posture, again, I think Iran the Islamic Republic has been a pretty opportunistic country, and it seizes upon opportunities to kind of use that as an explanation for what it's doing in the region. So it's done pretty well in the past in explaining its presence in places like Iraq and Syria. Syria less, Iraq more so, just because of the border that it shares and the porous nature of that border. And Iran has done that by saying things like, well, you know, we have threats like ISIS, we have to tackle them outside of the country. We don't want to tackle them inside the country. We'd rather do that because that's how we protect the Iranian border. And I would argue that the IRGC has had a certain amount of success in portraying it that way. And in fact, we saw the popularity of the IRGC increase and decrease given the context that they were facing. So again, during the rise of ISIS and the way that Iran was tackling the ISIS issue, well, their popularity rose because the IRGC kind of presented itself as Iran's savior, the protector of Iranian borders. And there you have a certain amount of nationalism that goes into it. But at times like today, where the focus is internal and the incompetence of the government is really quite obvious, then that rhetoric doesn't work as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bilal, please do respond if you like to anything you've heard so far. But you, perhaps one thing I wanted to really ask you, I'm very keen on your thoughts on this. If the states of the Middle East move in the direction of regional cooperation, more regional cooperation, and that's a big if, as you just heard. But if that happened, what do you see that might do in terms of the US having to adjust some of its policies? In other words, the US cannot afford to be seen as this extra regional power that comes in and prevents kind of friendly neighborly relations, as far-fetched as that sounds, but that's not a space US wants to occupy. But anyway, react to what you've heard and then maybe specifically take this last point I just mentioned.
Okay. First of all, thank you, Alex, for having me. I really appreciate it. And it's such an honor also to be with Dina and Hamad. One sentence I'm going to keep saying throughout this conversation is that anything GCC or Iran related, I'm going to defer to either Hamad or Dina. So I'll try to limit my comments to the US position. It's a very good question, Alex. I think the GCC states are sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place. Let's just assume, as you just described, that there is a greater interest on both sides, the Iranians and the Gulf Arabs, to move towards greater cooperation, right? Although I do agree with Mohammed that there are a number of limitations, regarding that prospect. But let's just assume that they head in that direction in the interest of preventing war, right? That's number one, fear of the Gulf Arabs, including the Iranians. So where does that leave the United States? We're talking about the Trump administration, obviously. So whatever we discuss regarding the US position, it's going to be between now and the next few months either, or the next few months in the next 4 years, right? So the Trump administration, given its policy of maximum pressure campaign against the Iranians, has always been criticized, rightly so, that there's just no end state to this policy. Now the administration disagrees. They'll flatly reject it, saying that no, there is an end state. We want these guys to come to the negotiation table, right? They want them to concede on a number of issues, and that is the whole point of the maximum pressure campaign. That said, they never really specified or defined clearly what the terms are and the parameters of those negotiations. I mean, they never said that, which tells you that there's really little interest genuinely in actually talking to the Iranians about any regional issue. It's more like you want to come to the negotiation table and then raise the white flag essentially and capitulate on a number of issues, which the Iranians are not going to do, obviously. That's the only card they have, which is to destabilize the region. If they lose that, if they fold that, there's nothing else for them to play with. Now, the GCC states have every interest in preventing a war, okay? They're the ones who stand to lose the most from any shooting contest between us and the Iranians. You know, we can, despite the number of personnel that we have in the regions, particularly in Iraq, we can still defend ourselves if there's, you know, if bullets start flying, but they can't. The Gulf Arabs can't. They don't have strategic depth. They cannot absorb significant hits as the Iraqis did during the Iran-Iraq war, right? So all the Iranians have to do is, you know, keep doing what they've been doing. Just operate below the threshold of war, right? Using asymmetric means. And if they're cornered, as Dina described, every now and then they'll lash out, they'll fire a few missiles or drones and cause total panic, right? That's all they need to do for the Gulf states to start feeling that they're existentially threatened. Now, the bigger worry for them is not just a shooting contest. It's the fact that you enter into that war without having any kind of guarantee or great confidence about the US position regarding protection. I mean, that's what's worse about the war. Okay, if we were to stumble into a war, accidentally, deliberately, what have you, what is worse about it for them is that they don't know how quickly and how effectively we would come to their rescue. They understand that Desert Storm was a long time ago. Not only is the US appetite today for such a massive military intervention greatly reduced for all sorts of reasons that you know already, but the nature of the threat has changed. I mean, I don't see the Iranians rolling their tanks into an Arab Gulf capital and invading anybody or occupying anybody. The Washington Post ran an editorial just not too long ago saying that, are we going to risk the lives of our troops in Saudi Arabia just to defend the Saudis? And the answer was no. To the Washington Post, obviously. If you ask that same question to many Americans today in a poll, I think they would probably reach the same conclusion. That's not what the Gulf Arabs want to hear. It's not that they, and most ironically, they're the ones who have been pushing for tougher stance against Tehran. But now that they see that the Trump administration is leading them on a path to a war, not deliberately, but at least, you know, by default. I mean, we are headed to military confrontation if there's no concessions whatsoever. For the next few months, which are going to be the trickiest, obviously, by the way, you know, always whenever there's a political transition in Washington, this is where things get interesting in foreign policy, right? Adversaries and even us. If we're getting closer to a military confrontation, then the Gulf Arabs also have to wonder, you know, not only do they not want a war and they want to avert one at all costs, but they have to think about if the Democrats win come January and then Joe Biden is sworn in, how deep do they want to go with the maximum pressure campaign between now and then? Because the farther they go, the harder the process of reconciliation is going to be with the Democrats. And so they're stuck between showing some kind of loyalty to this president, right? Because they can't really part ways with the Trump administration. That's only their only card also as far as security provision and their only card for protection, as despite all the concerns that they have about it. But that's their only card. If they part ways with the administration in the hopes that, you know, if there's a Democratic administration that, look, this is what we've done, we've really distanced ourselves from the Trump administration, let's get along, let's just start a new page. But they can't do this too far ahead because they just don't know who's going to win. So they have to balance between averting war, but at the same time showing some kind of loyalty to Trump to the extent that the guy even has a plan, right? I mean, I'm just assuming that there's this understanding or kind of coherent policy towards the Iranians, which the administration doesn't, okay? So the GCC is in a very difficult position now. They're in a dilemma, trying to balance between the sense of partnership and loyalty to Trump, and then the other hand, basically starting immediately to build bridges with an administration that's going to have a radically different view towards Iran if it were to be the Democrat. I guarantee you, Alex, the nuclear deal is going to be on the menu if Joe Biden wins. We're going to go back to whatever the Obama administration was doing before. And that's not exactly great news for the Gulf Arabs, but if they do it differently, in greater coordination this time around, right? Because we never consulted with these guys on the nuclear deal. But if the Joe Biden administration comes in and they start coordinating a little bit more effectively, diplomatically speaking, with the Gulf Arabs, then that's exactly what they want. So let me stop here.
Thank you. Very quick follow-up question. I'm just curious. I totally get it, Bilal, when you say they want to make sure they're playing nice with Trump as long as he's in the White House. But President Trump and his team will probably say, certainly in the last few weeks, in terms of what happened with the oil price and who got the blame for that, that actually this isn't that close of a friendship that you might think from the outside, which you can agree or disagree with. But what I'm saying is, if you're sitting in Riyadh today, why not do something similar like UAE has done, which is to sort of go out there independently and test the waters with the Iranians?
Because they're not there yet, Alex. They're not there yet.
They're not there.
Mohammed can tell you about the UAE view, and he's already done it. There's a much greater level of pragmatism in the UAE regarding the Iranians. And of course, being reciprocated by the Iranians themselves. There's no one more pragmatic than the Iranians, okay? But for some reason, whether it's ideological, religious, historical, there's deep enmity between the Saudis and the Iranians. That really has been a #1 obstacle to any kind of initiative by the Saudis to talk to the Iranians. I mean, you've always asked them that question. Why don't you do it? It is in your own interest. I mean, especially when US policy seems to be a liability to you. They're basically on a path to war that you don't want.
Right.
Why don't you come up with something on your own for your own self-interest to the benefit of your own region, your own security? And if they had confidence also in their own negotiation abilities, they would have done it a long time ago. But they don't want to do it on their own. They want the Americans on their side, except that we are not there. We're not interested in talking to the Iranians right now. All you want to do is just keep punishing them until the regime crumbles from within. It's sort of the same policy we had with the Soviet Union, right? It's maximum pressure against the Soviet Union in the hopes that one day the system from within would collapse. Problem is the Iranians haven't collapsed yet. And Dina will tell you, I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. Maybe down the road, but down the road, it could be the next few months, and we're going to have a new administration, and it's back to negotiation and compromises. So they want the Americans on their side. Rule #1 in international negotiations: don't bargain with a weak hand. And the Saudis have a weak hand if they don't have the Americans on their side, and they don't right now.
Thanks, Bilal. I just want to put out there about Saudi capabilities. We all remember how then Crown Prince Abdullah was able to cut a deal with the Iranians, then President Rafsanjani in the 1990s. So there has been examples of Saudi Arabia and Iran quietly together on a bilateral, basis, reducing tensions. The only difference between early 1990s and today is tensions are that much higher and much more complex than the situation was back then. But thanks, Bilal. We'll come back to
Alex, MBS is a different kettle of fish also. I mean, it doesn't strike me as the most dovish guy. He probably is the most hawkish among all his predecessors. Okay, there's no love lost between any Saudi king and the Iranians, but this guy's different. And you have to factor that. You have to factor that personality matters and leadership matters.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Let me turn back to Mohammed. Mohammed, we have some questions for you. So I'll start with one of the questions here, and then I'll go back to that issue of the question of the United States. The question, actually, I think I have two questions that are relevant right now for this segment. What is your reaction to how Iran responded to UAE's latest moves towards Tehran? And maybe you want to sort of talk about if you have picked up anything about a potential return of the UAE ambassador to Tehran, who I think is still not in Tehran, but there are some noises in Iran that the UAE ambassador might return, which, just for the sake of the audience, he has been gone, if I'm not mistaken, since the Saudi embassy was burned down back in 2015. So that would be a pretty big move if the UAE ambassador, in fact, goes back to Tehran. But what is your reaction to Iran's response so far to the UAE? And let me also ask you, actually, you take that and I'll come back to you, Mohammed. You take that first one.
Okay, now again, this is my personal view and observations. I think the reaction from Iran, was cordial to the aid, but internally it didn't lead to something much more than that. As far as the ambassador, I haven't seen indication that an ambassador would go, but I've seen indication that any further collaboration on COVID-19 would need some sort of on the ground, coordination. So someone from the UAE, not necessarily an ambassador, would need to be there. Maybe a Red Crescent type of coordination. But that, in my views, does not go up to what could have happened by now. What could have happened is that there's a lot that could have happened on the UAE, for instance, helping with establishing a new or field hospitals in Tehran, trying and helping with the testing, helping with a number of issues in which some sort of day-to-day coordination can happen and keep a certain type of line open. But I don't think that line is open yet.
Okay, and to my own question, Mohammed, why don't we hear more clearly an articulated position by the GCC states or individual member states, the more active in the realm of foreign policy, like the United Arab Emirates, that says basically to the Iranians, we want the United States to be here in the region for whatever reason. And just get that illusion out of the minds of the Iranians. It's a question I'm going to ask Dina later on. If you look at the latest Iranian peace initiative, HOPE, the Hormuz Peace Initiative, it basically boils down to, United States get out of the region and then we'll figure it out. And the GCC states don't want to just sit there without the United States to figure it out with a much larger neighbor called Iran. But why not just tackle that issue head on and say it, publicly and repeat it? We want the United States. Obviously, the U.S. is there. Bilal hinted at the number of troops across the region. I believe every GCC member state has American military personnel on their soil. There's a reason for that. But why not come out and say it and change that conversation? Because the Iranian authorities for the last 40 years have had one peace offer. It's us and you, and let's get the Americans out. How do you change that conversation?
Well, I think as far as the UAE is concerned, Minister Gargash has said this very clearly, that the Arabian Gulf is global waters. We cannot say that this is only regional. There's global interest in the amount of oil and trade that goes out of that region. And just to say that this is regional place, no one should be interested in, I think is a sort of a misnomer of some sort. I think the UAE has been clear. I think most of the GCC countries have been very clear right from the beginning. This is a global world. Iran, as well as the GCC countries, export oil out of that of the Hormuz Strait and out of the Arabian Gulf. So, but that oil goes to pretty much drive the world around us. So this is a global responsibility. Just to say that nobody should be involved in that security, I think. But to go back to your regionalism and regional cooperation, there has been a lot going on. It might not been, GCC Iran, but there has been a lot going on regional cooperation. And we've seen, you might take this differently, but the operation in Yemen was a coalition. That's a regional coalition. It was not an international coalition. So on the security level, whether you agree or don't agree, but that, in essence, that was some sort of a regional cooperation. Economic support to both, for instance, Egypt, as well as to Iraq. That's again regional cooperation. Diplomatic engagement with Ethiopia and Eritrea, that's again regional. It didn't happen on Iran for a reason. And that reason is that you need two to tango. I haven't heard a lot from Iran on what do they want. Yes, Iranians keep saying, we want the Saudis to come in and talk to us. But I think it is regional. I mean, there is a very important issue to be remembered here. Somehow in the discussion, the concept of rivalry came up. And this is not rivalry. Iran occupies Iceland for the UAE. Now, that means this is not rivalry, this is protection. Most recently, Iran has said that, you know, we have rights in Bahrain and we have rights in Kuwait. And that's not rivalry. So it's a different calculus, at least from where we stand. Mm-hmm. It cannot be changed very easy. If there is a need for security in the Strait of Hormuz, it's security against whom? It's against transgression from Iran. So we cannot just say, you know, let's the US go out. The US, and I respect what Bilal said, and I also understand some of the dynamics that's going on in the US. But the relationship with the US, between GCC and the US, is not only security, it's multidimensional. And to say that just removing the security dimension out of it is going to make it crumble, it's not. And every dimension is connected to the other. The amount of trade, the amount of even diplomatic ties, on political understanding, on the challenges around the world. There's a number of issues that we're very much entwined with the US. And I don't think it's dependency. It's not like we only have one card, which is the US. It's the issue that the US needs the GCC as much as the GCC needs them. And there is, of course, that type of dynamics where there is a push and pull factors playing at certain times. But if you look at the perspectives over, you know, the last 50 years, I don't think there is a lot that has changed drastically. The major thing that has changed was when Obama came in and said, look, you have to share some of that burden. You have to rely on yourself. And that's when a number of things started changing, where we cannot take the US for granted. Yes, the US is a producer of oil. They do not need the oil from the GCC, but the world needs it. And for the price of oil to be stable, now we understand that we need everyone to play. It's not only the GCC stop producing oil, it's also China and others start demanding it. So there's a dynamic that is going on, and there is more regionalism that is downing on people. But until now, it didn't materialize a lot with Iran. I can see, for instance, that when it comes to investment, GCC countries are looking at Korea, they're looking at Japan, they're looking at Indonesia, they're looking at Malaysia, they're looking at China. So there is a regionalism when it comes to Asianism, if you want. But when it comes to Iran, there's a different element, which is the security threat coming from Iran. And that needs to be removed before we can see things moving much faster.
Thank you, Mohammed. And I can tell you, you've started that Arabian Gulf, Persian Gulf, Arabian Gulf here, and my computer, I can see smoke coming out of my Mac. So thanks for that. I'll turn.
I mean, look, I call it from my fence, and someone else could call it something else from their fence. It shouldn't be an issue. That's my point.
I'll turn to Dina on that. I mean, Mohammed was talking about UAE building a hospital field, a field hospital, I should say, in Tehran. I mean, from my perspective, I've been to UAE many times, you know, hundreds of Iranian businesses and Iranians live in there. But I just can't see a UAE medical team showing up to help this Iranian regime. I just can't see it. And I think you know what I mean. I think most of us know what I mean. But it goes to something that, you know, the issue that Mohammed touched on again and again is lack of confidence. And just this last few days, I've come across, you know, statistics showing that Arab states actually are a good part of Iran's trading partners, including UAE, Iran's second biggest trading partner. And then this set of statistics was released a week after Ayatollah Khamenei asked the Revolutionary Guards to bring people to some of the islands that are in dispute between Iran and UAE. And now I don't know why it has taken 40 years before Iran decides that it's time to move people to these islands. Pretty big country, Iran. Timing wise is puzzling, but to me, I think it's clearly what they're signaling is that these islands are ours. Even if there's war, we won't let them go. So in other words, it's the opposite of reducing tensions, which takes me to my question. What is, if there is one, an Iranian strategy for the GCC states? I've never believed in one strategy. I think Iran plays them one by one, oftentimes against each other. But do you see a GCC strategy? And would it not be wise to have one?
So again, I agree with you. I don't think there is an Iranian strategy. But just before I get to that, I do think that there's a couple of things that you have to look at when you're looking at Iran's relations with its neighbors. I actually disagree with Mohammed, if I can, respectfully. I do think that there is an element of a rivalry, and there always has been. I don't think it's purely linked to the Islamic Republic, because Iran and its neighbors were competing even before the Islamic Republic came to be in 79. It made it worse, that's for sure. But there was a competition that was there to begin with. There was an ideological competition, a size-based competition. Even their governments are the governance is based on different principles. Their visions for the region are based on different principles. As we said, Iran wants the US out. The Gulf Arab states want to internationalize regional security. So it's inevitable that you end up with these two sides being pitted against each other because they just don't see the region in the same way. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think today it's worse than it has been in a long time by virtue of the personalities that are in place. And this goes back to what Bilal was saying. I think MBS is just a different kettle of fish. I think MBZ is a different kettle of fish to what we had prior. And that's why, I mean, these two individuals are fundamentally opposed to Iran. They dislike Iran in a way that perhaps, I'm not saying it's one-sided. The Iranians have these issues as well. But I would argue that the other problem is that Iran views the Gulf Arab states differently to the way that the Gulf Arab states views Iran. There's a mismatch in threat perception. For the Gulf Arab states, Iran is a major concern. For Iran, its neighbors are a nuisance more than anything else. And they've become an even greater nuisance under the Trump administration. But generally, Iran sees itself as a force to be reckoned with, both inside and outside the region. And so its focus is on, dealing with the US, dealing with the Europeans, the Russians, the Chinese. And the region for it is just an arena for its influence. And the Gulf Arab states are a pain in that respect from Tehran's perspective. Finally, in terms of building ties between the two sides, I think there is no strategy. I think that it has been a reactive strategy. I wouldn't even call it a strategy, just a reaction. So if there was an opportunity to deal with the Gulf Arab states, then the Iranians would take it. And in fact, since the Rouhani administration has come to power, they have, at least in rhetoric, have consistently said, we're trying to mend ties with the Gulf Arab states, and it's the other side that doesn't want it. Now, when they have the opportunity to in turn be a nuisance to the Gulf Arab states, then they will also take that. And I think that their their involvement in Yemen is a very good example of that. So the problem is, from both sides of the aisle, you have opportunism and you have a desire to engage only to de-escalate. So you don't really have a desire to engage on a wider range of issues. You have a desire to engage today because threats are so high, particularly from the perspective of the Gulf Arab states, that you want to ensure that, if maximum pressure gets out of hand, then it doesn't play out within your countries, which is why you have this desire to de-escalate today. So the objective is so narrow that you're never going to find yourself in a situation where both sides are engaging fruitfully on a wide range of issues. And then just in terms of the answering your question of could we ever see, for example, Emiratis coming to Iran and building a field hospital? I think from the perspective of the average Iranian, sure, why not? I think from the perspective of the Iranian government, though, it's a different issue. It's not because it's the Emiratis that would potentially be offering that, but any foreigner that would potentially be offering assistance to Iran is problematic. Look at the way the Iranians reacted to the offer from MSF, the Médecins Sans Frontières. It was rejected because the IRGC wants to be seen as the sole savior of the Iranian nation. They are the ones helping Iranians. They are the ones ensuring that this country is going to survive things like the COVID outbreak.
Right. Thank you. But I have to also say, like I said before, it's a risky strategy for the Revolutionary Guards, because if they break it, that they have broken it, they own it. And that's what they're doing in the region. But that's a separate point. Let me, thanks.
Alex, can I touch on a theme?
I actually have a question for you. Don't forget what you're saying, because I just want to make sure I read out the questions from the audience.
Shoot.
So there are a number of questions that basically are overlapping, and it boils down to why you, are you, maybe I should rephrase it, are you confident that the Democrats, should they win in the next elections in November, they'll pursue an entirely different agenda vis-a-vis Iran? You touched on JCPOA, the nuclear deal from 2015, but perhaps even broadly speaking. And another question sort of says, even going back to the days of President Obama, the sort of US policy has been, let me make sure I understand the question right. The question is, there's no difference in a long-term grand strategy of the Americans when it comes to the Middle East, but the Democrats and the Republicans. And why can't the Saudis understand that? You don't have to touch on the Saudi part if you don't want to, but what about that argument that this is an illusion to expect that come January 2021, if there is a President Biden, that everything will change in US-Iran relations?
I mean, I don't know about everything, but look, I can't predict the future, but if he does win, there's no question that he's going to have a fundamentally different view on how to approach the Iranians. I mean, this is a person whose boss was President Obama, and they were on the same page on how to approach the Iranians. And I mean, I don't need to remind you of the intense years-long negotiations with the Iranians to reach a nuclear deal. I think they're going to go back to that. Just read the statements of Joe Biden. I mean, those are important indications of what's going to come if he were to win. On long-term strategy, yes. I mean, there's just some issues that are just not going to change. We're not going to pull out. We're not going to draw down significantly just because we want to make peace with the Iranians. No, I mean, there's just so many variables into that that have nothing to do with the Iranians and why we're in the Middle East. Whether it's grand strategy or geopolitical position in the world, has little to do with the Iranians. So yeah, I mean, there's some logic to, and there's some merit to the argument that not everything is going to change, but of course tensions are going to subside. I mean, there's going to be massive de-escalation. We're going to be back on a path of diplomatic rapprochement. Whether that leads to something, I don't know, but yes, it's going to be different. There's a greater chance of trust coming back between the GCC and the US if we were to pursue a joint diplomatic approach, unlike what we did under Obama. I mean, the nuclear deal was essentially a US affair. Okay, we never really consulted with the Gulf states. We briefed them every now and then on the proceedings of the negotiations, but we never really told them that we were going to do it or that we were going to reach a deal that would not address their number one concern, which is Iran's sectarian drive and expansionism in the region. Well, maybe we can rectify that mistake next time around. Maybe we'll just bring them on board. And yes, as problematic maybe or as annoying as it is, since the GCC is not one body, obviously they're all going to have different opinions and different approaches to the Iranians, but just assuming we have some semblance of one block of the GCC, then of course bring them on board and have them issue their concerns, tell us what their preferences are. We'll try to incorporate as many as we can, probably not all of them, obviously, but definitely we could do better than what we did last time, because we completely ignored them last time. We basically had to put them in the dark. They were not consulted on any of those negotiations. And part of it, I understand, okay, these are high-level negotiations, we want to maintain secrecy. We didn't even brief, we didn't even consult with the Israelis, our top ally in the Middle East, right? But that issue of trust is so important for them. Alex, I've been working on the issue of partnership between these two sides for some time now. And God, there's just so many holes in that partnership, right? And there's so many gaps. And it didn't start with the nuclear deal. I mean, I would take it back, even though it is the most, common one raised by historians, that this is when things really started to get messy between the two sides and distrust started to emerge. Not true. It wasn't even during the Mubarak fiasco. It goes back to earlier than that, as far as Iran is concerned, at least. It was during the second term of Bush. Bush, at no point in his two terms, was considering attacking the Iranians. I mean, he was consumed by the Iraq war. That was his number one priority as far as the Middle East. But at some point during the second term, his cabinet came over to him with John Bolton at the time. Shocking, right? John Bolton and Dick Cheney and the Israelis. They came over and told him, we got to do something, otherwise the Iranians are going to obtain a nuclear weapon. And so he goes to the Pentagon. I mean, just read Bob Woodward. This is now open source. He goes to the Pentagon, tells them, give me some military options. And they do. The Pentagon gives him military options, but he never pulls the trigger. But at no point in that process did he ever consult with the Gulf Arabs. So the Gulf Arabs were so worried about a war that was going to happen that they had no clue when it was going to happen, and there was no joint planning for the day after. So I remember the Emiratis would go to Brussels, shuttle diplomacy, come to Washington, and try to fish for any information about, are we going to go to war or what? And if we are, good God, let's just be better prepared together. At that point, a crisis of trust started to emerge. It got much worse with the Obama nuclear deal. And then finally with Trump, which tells you that this is like successive administrations, right? Regardless of the political orientation. There was a pattern now. And here comes Trump. He goes after Soleimani. He never tells them. Now I understand there are operational considerations. You want to maintain, once again, confidence, diplomatic, operational secrecy. You want any leaks about it, so to make sure that you succeed in your operation. Oh boy, such a major assassination. You don't want to tell your partners about it in advance? I mean, this would have had it could have gone wrong on so many levels. And the Iranians would have fought back so much more fiercely than they have. You owe it to them to tell them we're about to take on the #1 viceroy of the Iranians in the Middle East, General Qasem Soleimani, but they didn't. And you know what MBS did. He dispatched his brother, came to Washington, and said, what the hell? You definitely could have consulted with us. So this crisis of trust has been going on for some time now, and this lack of security coordination, despite our massive presence in the region, despite all the flowery rhetoric about us sharing an alliance with them, when it comes to crunch time and going to war or making peace, we never coordinate with these guys. And it's a major flaw, and that's music to the ears of the Iranians. They know that there are flaws in that relationship. And all they've been trying to do, I think Dina has mentioned it, is try to test it. Try to test that relationship. That is, they don't have a strategy for the Gulf states. They have a strategy for the United States and how to actually create a wedge between the two. And they've been pretty good at it. Look where the Qataris are now. Look where the Kuwaitis are. Oman is the eternal mediator. Fine, I'm not going to put them in any camp. But this is what they try to do, is try to drive a wedge between the two and exploit that existing lack of trust between the two sides. I'll stop here.
Thanks, Bilal. And actually, you touched on a very important point. We don't have time to get into it, but not only Iran, but the U.S. finds the issue of the schism within the GCC states tough to deal with. And you could argue U.S. could have done a lot better earlier in the day when that GCC split first happened. But didn't. That we'll see what the consequences are. We see some of it. I've seen for the last few years, but interesting that Iran was not a real big factor in that GCC schisms. But we have about 5 minutes left, and I want to do a speedy tour, if I may, and start with Mohammed. Mohammed, it's really hard to go around in Washington these days without seeing China being mentioned in any context. So tell me about China. What do you think China is going to be a bigger, stronger presence in the calculations of the GCC states or that of the UAE going forward as a result of this? And bear in mind, this country right now will be looking inward. I mean, I saw some of the statistics yesterday, 20% unemployment rate in the United States. If there's a time for nation building, today is that time. But will China try and take advantage of this? And would the GCC states be watchful?
Absolutely. But if I may, Dina, also respectfully disagree. I don't think leadership here dislike Iran. I think that's a very strong statement. No one dislikes Iran. There are people who distrust the administration in Iran, but as Alex pointed out, the number of Iranian diaspora here in the UAE, the number of Iranian businesses, the number of business relationship with Iran are not those of someone who dislike a country. So yes, there is a distrust, but it's not dislike of a country.
To be clear, I meant dislike of the Islamic Republic.
Well, I've heard Iran, so I'm just and the idea again of that there is an entire, either Saudi Arabia or the UAE or other Gulf countries putting all of their efforts to counter Iran as a part of rivalry. I think most of the efforts are done internally. and a lot of it is on diversification of income, and that's where we get to China. The relationship with China is prior to COVID-19. It's based on the understanding that the GCC countries are moving away from oil, and part of what they want to do is to create that corridor of trade. And that corridor of trade goes from China all the way to the US and Europe. All of the investment that they have been doing so far was to try and build up on that corridor. And if you look at Dubai being a hub for air traffic, looking at investment in ports, looking at investment in shipping companies, all of this is based on that. Now, China is going to play that role. And this also brings us to the idea of that this is not a polar world anymore, where you're either with the US or you with China or with Russia. It's a networked world. And in that networked world, we can have relationship with different countries. I think the US is going into the direction of making it a polar world. The accusations to China, the ability or the attempt to make China pay for the losses out of COVID-19 is going to create some sort of polarity. But that polarity, if you look at Africa, if you look at Asia, is not always going to be in the side of the US. Even though I'm saying that part of our, the biggest partner for the UAE, for the GCC is the US on so many levels, not only that. But China is going to be an important part of the mix of the maybe not in security, at least at this time or in the foreseeable future. But when it comes to economy, if China stops or continue its demand for oil the way it is right now today, it is not going to be healthy. And you can see how China is important not only for the UAE and Saudi Arabia because of their oil, but also for Africa, for a number of countries that are consuming what China is producing.
Thank you, Mohammed. Dina, we have a few minutes left. I'm sorry to give you a big question, but I guess the question is really about, from an audience member, how do you assess the sort of Hormuz peace initiative? Maybe you want to broaden that into sort of efforts so far as regional security architecture is concerned. They haven't really gone anywhere. But in your mind, what are the key obstacles? I think Mohammed raises a very important issue. China might be a big economic power, but I don't see any Chinese hard power in the Middle East. And I'm not even sure the Chinese know what they want to do in the Middle East if they had to fight for the oil. But back to the question, regional security architecture, where are we on that?
Yeah, I don't think any suggestion of regional security architecture so far has had any traction, again, because I think suspicions have run too deep. I think despite the fact that countries on both sides of the aisle will say that they want regional security, they want de-escalation of tensions, I think ultimately, like I said earlier, their objectives are so limited to de-escalation that I'm not even sure there is the political will to pursue regional security, and importantly, to make the sacrifices necessary in order to reach some sort of compromise on regional security and creating an architecture. Having said that, I think that the number one principle of regional security for the region should be that next time that they pursue it, it should be an inclusive one. Up until now, any kind of regional security architecture has been directed at excluding problematic states or directed against problematic states. That, in my opinion, doesn't increase security. It merely reduces it and makes things worse because, again, it's a lower level of what maximum pressure has done, right? It ends up cornering a state, which means it ends up lashing out against that group of other states. I think we do need to include major powers, despite the fact that the Iranians don't want to. I think that the US, particularly the US, I put aside Russia and China for a second, I think that the US plays an interesting role. It is Iran's stated desire to get rid of America from the region because that's just the way that the Iranian revolution, it's what it's been built on. But I also think that America presents Iran with a useful enemy it is a useful enemy for it to focus on in the region. And that has had its upsides for Iran. And we can't also dismiss that the two countries have, in a very, very limited capacity, been able to talk to or work with each other, even under periods of pretty high animosity. So I do think that major powers will be useful. I think that they need to have a stake in building regional security, and they need to help mediate it, because ultimately it's a region where everybody has a role and everybody's involved, and so you won't be able to have a security architecture where they're not. And then I do think in terms of process, the best way to do it is to negotiate it in bundles. I know it's in the academic sphere, it's very much in fashion to talk about the OSCE as a model. Actually, I don't think it's fair to say in fashion, because people have been talking about it for a while, but the OSCE as a model for a regional security architecture in the Middle East. I think there is some truth to that, in the sense that it's good to separate it into issue areas and have various experts talk about different bundles at the same time, and that all these areas should progress simultaneously, because there are inevitably going to be political areas that are going to take a lot longer to negotiate, and then other non-political issue areas like, you know, water scarcity, the environment, the drug trade, things like that are less political, and the countries in the region will be able to deal with without it creating too much of a headache for them. So I do think that it's a possibility. I think that for the foreseeable future, sadly, it isn't, and that's only because, from my perspective, there is no political will to drive this forward at the moment.
Thank you so much, Tina. Bilal, we're over time, but I owe you the last question. You get to have the final say here, but I'm hoping you're going to give us some maybe uplifting remarks. But here's my question, which is not going to set the stage for your uplifting remarks, or maybe I'm wrong. A lot of statements that I'm picking up from Iran the last few days, that and this question is about U.S. military preparedness or redeployment. That the U.S. is looking to build its military forces up significantly in Iraq, with the idea of basically going for that military confrontation once and for all. I don't see any of that in Washington. I wonder what the Iranians are thinking. But do you see any signs of that kind of a political decision having been made, that, you know what, we got to deal with this regime, if it means use military force, let's do it. Iraq is not a bad staging ground for that. Comments, reactions, or anything in between?
Oof. I mean,
I gave you a big one, I know. I apologize.
look, you got to start with the commander-in-chief and what his political calculations are. This is a season now for political calculations. I mean, anything to get reelected. And this is someone who's campaigned on a promise to end, you know, endless wars in the Middle East. Sure, he could change his mind like in the next 24 hours. I mean, that's how unpredictable he is. But this is a big deal. This is no small change, departure in policy. Right. And he's, even though he is the president of the United States, I mean, such a decision would definitely have to be vetted by, you know, the generals and people who are actually physically present in the region. I don't see any really clear indications of us ramping up, but I mean, I think Hamad used that sense before. It takes two to tango. I mean, if the Iranians do something stupid, which they're perfectly capable of, you know, one thing could lead to another, and I don't need to remind you how things fire out of control. And, you know, for now, it's been, you know, relatively contained, despite the fact that we took out a major figure in their military apparatus with Soleimani. But I mean, Abqaiq did happen too, and we did nothing. Shockingly, frankly, shocked me also, shocked the heck out of the Saudis also, and the entire world. But I mean, I can't say with great confidence that next time around we wouldn't respond if the Iranians do something stupid. But in terms of clear, deliberate plan to go to war against the Iranians over the next few months, no, I doubt it. And we could start a war with the Iranians. We're not going to finish it within the next few months. And that's just not what the president wants as he go to, you know, re-election campaign. I don't think so. It starts with him. And I don't think this is what he's thinking.
Thank you, Bilal. Our time is up. We could continue, but I want to thank Bilal, Mohammed, Dina for your wonderful set of remarks. I learned a lot. I'm sure the audience did too. Thank you again, and come back and join us for another webinar. And the same goes for the folks who are watching this. Please come back to the MEI website with a lot of good programming coming up. So we look to have you back on and listening in. Thanks again, and have a great day.
Thanks, Alex.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.